A CEO laughed and sold a single mom a crumbling garage for $500 just to avoid paying taxes on it. Just worthless scrap land beside dead railway tracks, he said, not worth a second thought. What she didn't know, hidden beneath that floor, was a secret her late father had buried years ago. And it was about to make the CEO regret every word he ever said to her. Maya Carter had exactly $43 in her checking account on the morning everything changed. She knew the number by heart because she had checked it 3 times before leaving for work, the way people check a wound they are not sure has stopped bleeding. $43. Rent was due in 11 days. Ethan needed new shoes before the school trip, and the transmission job she had stayed up until midnight finishing had paid her $60, half of what any real shop would have charged. She pulled her jacket tighter and walked through the cold Monday morning air toward the bus stop, her toolbox in one hand and a travel mug of coffee in the other. Akron looked the way it always looked in November: gray sky, empty lots, tired buildings holding themselves up out of habit. She had grown up in this city. She knew every cracked sidewalk and every shuttered factory. She also knew that most people her age had already left. Maya had stayed. Not because she had no choice, but because Ethan was here, his school was here, and somewhere in this city was the garage her father used to take her to when she was small. He would lift the hood of whatever broken thing someone had dragged in, and he would say, "Every machine has a story, Maya. You just have to listen." Her father had been gone for 4 years now. The garage he once dreamed of owning had never happened. She was still thinking about him when she turned the corner and stopped walking. There it was. A squat, square building sitting beside a stretch of inactive railway tracks that ran behind Millard Street. The walls were stained concrete, the roll-up door was rusted halfway down, and weeds had pushed through the cracked asphalt around it, like the earth itself was slowly swallowing the place. A small orange notice was taped to the front door. Scheduled for demolition, property of Hale Industrial Group. Maya had passed this garage dozens of times. She had never thought much about it. But something about that demolition notice made her stop and stare. She was still staring when a black car pulled up behind her. Victor Hale stepped out of the car and looked at the garage the way a man looks at a receipt he doesn't remember signing. He was 52, polished in the way that money polishes people. Expensive coat, good shoes, the kind of calm that comes from never worrying about $43. He had flown into Akron that morning specifically to clear 6 abandoned industrial properties from his company's books before the investor conference in New York next week. Clean records made clean presentations. That was all this trip was. He noticed the woman standing on the sidewalk, looking at the building. "You need something?" he asked. Maya turned around. She recognized the logo on the car door. Hale Industrial. She had seen it on the demolition notice. "This building," she said. "Are you selling it or just tearing it down?" Victor glanced at the garage, then back at her. "Tearing it down. It's been sitting empty for 15 years. Not worth the maintenance costs." "I want to buy it." He blinked. "Excuse me?" "I want to buy it," Maya repeated. Her voice was steady, even though her heart was doing something uncomfortable in her chest. "I'm a mechanic. I've been looking for a space to open a small shop, something I can actually afford. This is the only thing in my price range in this neighborhood." Victor looked at her for a moment, then looked at the building again. Cracked walls, rusted door, dead weeds. He had a conference in 4 days and approximately 40 more important things to deal with before then. This building was costing his company $300 a month in maintenance fees just to sit here and deteriorate. He almost laughed. Then he did laugh, a short, dry sound. "Lady, this is worthless scrapland. The rail lines beside it haven't been active in 2 decades. Nobody wants anything near those tracks." He paused. "But fine, $500 and it's yours. Saves me from paying next month's taxes on it." Maya opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. $500. Cash or certified check, by end of week. He was already reaching into his jacket for his phone. My assistant will draw up the paperwork. It'll be the fastest deal I close this year. He said it like a joke. Maya did not laugh. By Thursday, the keys were in her hand. She stood alone inside the garage that evening, her flashlight cutting through the dark. Dust floated in the beam. The air smelled like motor oil and old metal, and underneath that, something she could only describe as time. She swept her light slowly across the floor, and that was when she noticed it. Painted directly onto the concrete beneath 15 years of grime, faded but unmistakable, were railroad markings. Precise, deliberate, the kind that surveyors use. Maya crouched down and ran her fingers along the lines. Why would anyone paint railroad markings inside a garage? She had no answer, but the question followed her home that night and sat beside her while she slept, patient as a locked door waiting for the right key. Maya had not planned on bringing Ethan to the garage. She had planned on going alone after her evening shift, spending an hour sweeping out the worst of the debris, maybe testing the electrical panel to see if anything still worked. Practical things, responsible things. The kind of small, careful steps she had learned to take when she could not afford mistakes. But Ethan had been waiting on the front steps when she got home, backpack still on, homework finished, eyes already asking the question before his mouth did.
Can I see it? She looked at her 10-year-old son, his father's jawline, her father's eyes, and said yes before she could talk herself out of it. So there they were, 2 people and 1 flashlight, in a building that smelled like rust and forgotten years, picking through decades of other people's leftovers. Broken shelving units, empty oil drums, a calendar on the wall from 2009 with a photo of a mountain range that had nothing to do with Ohio. Ethan moved through it all like he was on a treasure hunt, which Maya supposed he was. She moved through it like a woman mentally calculating how much cleaning would cost her in time she didn't have. "Mom," Ethan said from somewhere near the back wall, "this shelf is weird." "Weird how?" "It doesn't go all the way to the floor. Look." Maya walked over and shone the flashlight at the base of the shelf unit, a long, heavy steel rack bolted into the concrete wall. Ethan was right. There was a visible gap beneath it, maybe 3 inches, but what made it strange was that the concrete floor directly beneath the shelf looked different. Slightly smoother, less stained, like it had been protected from something, or hidden under something. Maya grabbed one end of the shelf and pulled. It didn't move. She pulled harder. Nothing. Ethan found a rusted flathead screwdriver on the floor and handed it to her without being asked. She wedged it into the side bracket, worked it back and forth, and on the 3rd try, the shelf lurched sideways with a sound like a groan. They dragged it together, scraping it across the floor until it cleared the space. Beneath it was a metal panel, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, flush with the floor, with a small recessed handle that had been painted over so many times it had nearly disappeared into the surface. Maya and Ethan looked at each other. She hooked her fingers under the handle, broke the paint seal with the screwdriver, and pulled. The panel lifted with a hiss of old, trapped air. Inside was a shallow compartment, maybe 8 inches deep. Not a room, not a tunnel, just a storage space. But what was stored in it had been wrapped carefully in oilcloth, sealed against moisture, and placed there by someone who expected whatever was inside to last. Maya lifted the oilcloth bundle out and set it on the floor. Inside was a folded set of maps, old rail company surveys printed on thick paper that had yellowed at the edges, but held together cleanly. Beneath the maps were 3 rusted tools she didn't immediately recognize, more mechanical than practical, the kind of specialized instruments surveyors use. And at the very bottom of the compartment was a metal tube,
the kind used for storing blueprints or legal documents, sealed at both ends with rubber stoppers that had hardened with age. Ethan watched as Maya worked one stopper free and carefully slid out the contents. Handwritten notes.
12 pages dense with measurements, coordinates, and annotations in the tight, disciplined handwriting of someone who had spent their life being precise. The pages were dated across several years, the earliest from 1987, the latest from 2003. At the bottom of the last page, beneath the final set of figures, was a signature. Walter Jennings, Ohio Rail Survey Division. Maya sat back on her heels and read the notes in silence. Most of it was technical, numbers and compass bearings and references to land parcels she couldn't immediately place. But certain phrases surfaced from the technical language, like buoys on dark water. Access corridor, northern boundary undeclared. Easement preservation recommended. Future expansion value, significant if rail restoration proceeds. She read that last phrase twice. "What does it mean?" Ethan asked, reading over her shoulder. "I'm not completely sure," Maya said honestly. "Railroad paperwork, I think. Somebody stored it here a long time ago." She looked around the garage, then back at the notes. Somebody who didn't want it to get lost. She refolded everything carefully, replaced it in the tube, and wrapped it back in the oilcloth. She would read it properly at home, under better light, with coffee and time. Right now, it felt like holding something that mattered, without knowing yet how it mattered. The way her father used to hand her a part she'd never seen before and say, "Figure out where it goes." 300 miles away, in a glass-walled office above Chicago's financial district, a man named Dennis Cole placed a private industry report on Victor Hale's desk and waited. Victor read the executive summary once quickly, then again slowly. The report was 4 pages and cost his company $8,000. It had been commissioned quietly through a research firm that specialized in infrastructure intelligence, the kind of information that moved markets before markets knew they were moving. The summary was careful and hedged, the way expensive research always is, but the core of it was simple enough. 3 major private transportation companies were in early-stage discussions about restoring and modernizing freight rail routes through northern Ohio. The routes had been dormant for nearly 2 decades. Land along the corridors was currently valued at almost nothing. Currently. Victor set the report down and looked out the window at Lake Michigan, sitting flat and gray in the November light. He thought about the garage, the rusted door, the woman with the flashlight, the $500 he had practically thrown at her because the building was costing him $300 a month in taxes. He thought about those inactive railway tracks running directly behind Millard Street. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Find out if that woman, the one who bought the Millard Street property, has done anything with the transfer paperwork yet." "I'll check," his assistant said. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" Victor paused. "Just check," he said, and ended the call. He picked up the industry report again and turned to page 3, where a rough map showed the proposed freight corridor cutting through northern Ohio. His finger traced the line across the page, following it east through Akron, through the old industrial district, toward the rail depot near Millard Street. His finger stopped. He looked at the map for a long moment without moving. Then he set it face down on his desk like he was done with it. He was not done with it. Back in Akron, Maya sat at her kitchen table after Ethan had gone to bed. The documents were spread in front of her under the overhead light. She had read through the survey notes 3 times now and understood maybe half of them. But one thing was clear. Walter Jennings had known something about that property that most people didn't, and he had hidden the evidence carefully enough that it had survived 15 years of nobody looking. She pulled out a notepad and wrote the name down at the top of a fresh page. Walter Jennings. Beneath it, she wrote a single question. Why did he hide these here? She stared at the question for a while. Then she circled it, put the cap back on the pen, and went to bed. She didn't sleep well, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't because she was worried. The nursing home was called Lakeview Gardens, which Maya thought was optimistic given that there was no lake visible from any window and the only garden was a narrow strip of brown grass beside the parking lot. But the inside was warm and clean, and the woman at the front desk smiled when Maya gave Walter Jennings's name. "He's having a good morning," the woman said, which Maya understood meant that not all mornings were good ones. She had driven to Cleveland on a Saturday, leaving Ethan with her neighbor, Mrs. Paulson, who watched him sometimes in exchange for Maya fixing her ancient Honda whenever it decided to stop cooperating. The drive was an hour and 20 minutes. Maya had spent most of it rehearsing what she would say to a man she had never met, whose name she had found in a hidden compartment under a garage floor. There was no version of that opening that didn't sound strange. She settled on the truth, which was usually the least complicated option. Walter Jennings was 78 years old and looked like a man who had spent his life outdoors. Weathered face, large hands, the kind of stillness that comes from decades of careful, patient work. He was sitting in a chair beside the window when the nurse brought Maya in, a paperback book open in his lap that he wasn't reading. He looked up when she entered and studied her with clear, direct eyes that hadn't aged the way the rest of him had. "Mr. Jennings," Maya said. "My name is Maya Carter. I'm sorry to bother you. I found your name in some documents, and I was hoping you might be able to help me understand them." Walter looked at her for a moment. "Carter," he repeated. "What kind of documents?" Maya opened her bag and carefully set the metal tube on the small table beside him. She watched his face as he looked at it. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. The way a person looks when they see something they buried a long time ago suddenly sitting in front of them in the light. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. "In a garage on Millard Street in Akron. I recently bought the property." Walter's hands went still on the arms of his chair. He looked up at her slowly. "Millard Street," he said. "The building beside the old freight tracks." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, a sparrow landed on the brown grass, looked around as if disappointed, and left. "Sit down," Walter said. He had worked for the Ohio Rail Survey Division for 31 years, he told her. Started as a junior surveyor in 1972, worked his way up, spent most of his career mapping industrial corridors across the state. It was detailed, unglamorous work that most people never thought about, drawing the invisible lines that determined where things could be built, where trains could run, where cities could eventually grow. In the late 1980s, the freight rail network across northern Ohio began contracting. Lines that had operated for decades were quietly shut down as trucking became cheaper. Depots closed, maintenance yards went dark. The rail companies began selling off land, piece by piece, sometimes carelessly, offloading parcels without fully accounting for what they were releasing. Walter and a small group of senior engineers had seen this coming. "We knew the lines wouldn't stay dormant forever," he said. His voice was steady, but slower than it might once have been, each word placed deliberately. "Infrastructure doesn't disappear. It just waits. And we knew that if the corridor land got broken up and sold off without anyone preserving the boundary records, restoring the network someday would become nearly impossible. Legal nightmares, competing ownership claims, gaps in the route that couldn't be filled." So they had done something quiet and unofficial. They had documented the expansion corridors, the emergency land buffers that had been built into the original rail designs decades earlier, and hidden copies of those records in properties along the route. Properties that were unlikely to be developed quickly. Properties that would sit undisturbed long enough to matter. The garage on Millard Street was one of them. Maya sat very still. "You chose that garage specifically. It sat on the edge of the most important junction in the northern corridor," Walter said. "The land boundary for that property extends beyond the visible garage structure. Most people looking at the deed would never know. But the original survey lines, the ones we documented in those notes, show that the property sits at the access point for the entire eastern section of the corridor." Maya thought about Victor Hale calling it worthless scrapland. She thought about the $500. What does that mean practically? She asked, keeping her voice even. It means that anyone who wants to build along that corridor, whether it's a rail company, a logistics firm, a cargo terminal, would need access through that junction. And the property that controls the junction, he paused and looked at her steadily, controls a great deal. The room felt suddenly smaller. Why didn't you tell anyone officially? Maya asked. Why hide it? Walter's expression shifted, something between regret and pragmatism. Because the rail company lawyers would have absorbed the records, buried the corridor claims in litigation for 20 years, and the land would have been sold off anyway. We weren't trying to cause a legal fight. We were trying to preserve the information long enough for someone to use it correctly. He looked at the metal tube. I never expected it to take this long. Maya opened her mouth to ask the next question, the one she most needed answered, when the door opened. The woman who stepped in was around 50, professionally dressed, with Walter's same direct eyes and considerably less patience in them. She looked at Maya the way people look at strangers who appear unexpectedly beside someone they are protective of. Dad, she said carefully, you should rest. Patricia, Walter said, 5 more minutes. The doctor said 5 minutes, he repeated, with a quiet firmness that stopped her. Patricia stayed in the doorway. Maya understood the visit was ending, regardless of what either of them wanted. She gathered the documents and stood. Walter reached out and touched the metal tube once before she lifted it. A brief, light contact, like saying goodbye to something. Mr. Jennings, Maya said. My father's name was David Carter. He worked near those rail lines in the early 2000s. Did you ever? Walter looked up sharply. Something moved behind his eyes, recognition, and something heavier beneath it. Before he could answer, Patricia stepped fully into the room. I'm sorry, she said to Maya, not unkindly. He really does need to rest. Maya nodded and picked up her bag. She was at the door when Walter spoke again. His voice was low, just loud enough to reach her. Whatever happens, he said, don't sell too fast. Maya turned back, but Patricia had already moved beside her father, and his eyes had closed, and the moment was gone. She walked back to her car in the gray Cleveland afternoon with more questions than she had arrived with, and the distinct feeling that Walter Jennings had recognized her father's name. He had not looked surprised. He had looked like a man who had been waiting for that name to surface for a very long time. The following Monday, Victor's assistant placed a single note on his desk. The Carter woman visited Walter Jennings at Lakeview Gardens Nursing Home, Cleveland, Saturday, approximately 40 minutes. Victor read it twice. Then he picked up his phone and called his property lawyer. I need everything on the Millard Street land transfer, he said. Title history, boundary surveys, original rail company records, everything that exists. He paused. And find it before she does. The news broke on a Tuesday. Maya heard it the way most people in Akron heard things, secondhand, through someone else's conversation. She was underneath a Ford pickup at the garage, replacing a worn-out exhaust manifold, when she caught the tail end of what 2 men were saying on the sidewalk outside the open roll-up door. Whole Eastern Corridor, apparently. Cargo terminal the size of 3 airport hangars. Buying land already. My cousin said they offered his neighbor $400,000 for a parking lot on Birch Street. Maya slid out from under the truck and sat up. Sorry, she called toward the sidewalk. What's happening on Birch Street? The 2 men looked over. One of them, older, work jacket, coffee in hand, shrugged like the information was public property. Some big logistics company, National Rail Dynamics or something like that. They're building a cargo hub somewhere around northern Ohio. Nobody knows the exact location yet, but developers are already moving through Akron, buying up industrial land before the announcement. He sipped his coffee. If you own anything around the old rail district, you're probably about to have a good week. He said it conversationally and walked on. Maya stayed sitting on the concrete floor of her garage for a full 30 seconds without moving. Then she picked up her phone and searched the name.
National Rail Dynamics was not a company that advertised itself. Its website was spare and corporate. A logo, a mission statement about modernizing American freight infrastructure, a contact form. But the news articles that had appeared in the last 48 hours told a different story.
3 separate business publications had picked up a leaked investor document suggesting the company was planning the largest private rail construction project in the country in over 20 years. A high-speed cargo terminal network connecting major Midwest shipping hubs. The Ohio Corridor was described as the network's eastern spine. Estimated investment, $4 billion. Estimated completion, 4 years. Maya read the articles twice, then set her phone down on the workbench and looked at the walls of her garage. Her garage. The one she had bought for $500 2 months ago. The one that sat beside inactive freight tracks on Millard Street. Her phone rang before she could finish the thought. She didn't recognize the number. "Ms. Carter?" The voice was professionally warm, the kind of voice that belonged to someone whose job was to make large numbers sound casual. "My name is Robert Finch. I represent ClearPath Development Group. I understand you recently acquired the property at 114 Millard Street, and I'd love to have a conversation with you about." "How did you get this number?" Maya asked. A brief pause. "Property transfers are public record, Ms. Carter. We do thorough research." Another pause, smoother this time. "We'd like to offer you $120,000 for the property, as is, no repairs, no conditions, quick close." Maya's grip on the phone tightened. $120,000. She thought about Ethan's school trip. She thought about the $43. She thought about Walter Jennings saying, "Don't sell too fast," in a voice that carried the weight of a man who had been watching people make expensive mistakes for 30 years. "I'll think about it," she said, and ended the call. By the end of that week, she had received 6 more offers. The lowest was $90,000. The highest was $240,000. Each caller was polished, unhurried, and careful not to explain exactly why the property was suddenly worth that much. They spoke about market conditions and development potential and being ahead of the curve, which Maya had learned was how people described profiting from information that other people didn't have yet. She wrote down every offer, every company name, and every phone number in the notepad she had started on the night she found the documents. Then she called the one person she trusted to understand what she was looking at. Her mechanic friend and part-time business partner, Ray Okafor, sat across from her at the kitchen table that evening with the notepad open in front of him and a look on his face that was equal parts excitement and caution. "6 offers in 5 days, he said. 7 now. Another one came in this afternoon. Ray leaned back in his chair. He was 44, practical in the way that people who had built things with their own hands tended to be practical. He had worked in automotive logistics for 12 years before opening his own small shop, and he understood land and access routes in ways that most mechanics didn't. "They're not buying your garage, Maya," he said slowly. "They're buying your position, the location, whatever that property connects to." He tapped the notepad. "The question is, do they know exactly what they're connecting to? Or are they just guessing based on the map?" Maya thought about the documents, about Walter's words, about the boundary lines that extended beyond the visible garage structure. "I think most of them are guessing," she said. Ray nodded. "Then don't move until someone stops guessing and starts knowing. That's when you'll understand what it's actually worth." Victor Hale had not slept well in 2 weeks. He was sitting in a private meeting room on the 14th floor of the Meridian Hotel in Chicago when Dennis Cole placed the second report on the table. This one was not 8 pages. It was 22, with maps, projected land valuations, and route schematics that had cost significantly more than $8,000. Victor read it with the particular focused stillness of a man who had made his fortune by reading rooms and reports faster than the people across the table from him. The corridor routing was now confirmed. National Rail Dynamics had finalized the eastern section. The cargo terminal site was locked, and the primary industrial access route connecting the terminal to the 3 major shipping warehouses in the northeastern Akron district ran directly through a single junction point. One junction point. Victor's eyes moved to the map on page 9. 114 Millard Street. The corridor didn't just pass near the property, it passed through it. The access route, the only viable one given the geography of the rail lines and the existing warehouse positions, required passage across the land whose boundaries, according to Walter Jennings's hidden survey notes, extended well beyond what any standard title search would reveal. The garage he had sold for $500 controlled the only door into a network worth billions. Dennis Cole was watching him carefully from across the table. "What are our options?" Victor asked, his voice giving away nothing. "Legally," Dennis said, "we could challenge the land transfer on technical grounds. The sale was informal. There may be documentation gaps we can use." He hesitated. "Or we approach her directly, offer something generous enough that she takes it before she understands the full picture." "What has she been offered so far?" "Development companies are already circling. Highest offer we've tracked is around $240. Victor looked at the map for another moment. $240,000. To a woman working 2 jobs and raising a child alone, that was a life-changing number. It was the kind of number that made people sign quickly and ask questions later, when later was too expensive to matter. "Offer her $3 million, Victor said. Dennis blinked. $3 million is quiet, Victor said, not as an insult, as a description of how he wanted the approach handled. No lawyers, no pressure, a private meeting. Generous, reasonable, straightforward. He folded the report closed. People don't resist generosity. They resist feeling cornered. He said it like a strategy, because it was. What Victor did not know, could not know yet, was that on the same evening he was planning his approach in a Chicago hotel, Maya Carter was sitting on her garage floor, surrounded by the survey documents, a city map, and Ray Okafor's notes. And she had just found something in Section 7 of Walter Jennings's handwritten pages that she had missed on every previous reading. A boundary description. Precise coordinates that, when she traced them against the city map, showed the property line of 114 Millard Street, extending not just to the garage walls, but 40 meters further, directly across the only viable access route to the future cargo terminal site. She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up her pen, circled the coordinates, and wrote 3 words beside them. "This is it." The first inspector showed up on a Wednesday morning without an appointment. Maya was in the middle of an oil change when a man in a gray jacket walked through the open garage door, carrying a clipboard and the particular expression of someone who has already decided what they are going to find before they look. He introduced himself as a representative from the Akron Commercial Property Compliance Office and told her, pleasantly enough, that a routine inspection had been scheduled for the premises. Maya wiped her hands on a shop rag and watched him move through the garage. He photographed the electrical panel, measured the distance between the side wall and the emergency exit, tested the fire extinguisher mount, crouched down to examine the floor drainage, and made small noting sounds every few minutes. Not quite disapproval, not quite satisfaction. Just sound that meant he was writing things down. An hour later, he handed her a printed form with 4 violations listed. Inadequate ventilation clearance, improper hazardous material storage, exit signage non-compliant with current commercial code, floor drainage insufficient for licensed automotive work. Maya read the list twice. She had worked in 3 different shops over the years. 2 of them had looked significantly worse than her garage and had never received a single inspection notice. "What's the correction timeline?" she asked. 30 days, the man said. "After that, continued operation becomes a liability issue." He said it helpfully, like he was doing her a favor. She thanked him, filed the form on her workbench, and went back to the oil change. That evening, she called the compliance office to confirm the inspection had been officially scheduled. The woman on the phone checked twice and told her there was no inspection on record for 114 Millard Street. Maya thanked her, hung up, and sat very still for a moment. Then she took the violation form, photographed it, and added it to the folder she had started keeping for exactly this kind of thing. The loan delay came the following week. Maya had applied for a small business development loan 6 weeks earlier, $12,000 to cover equipment upgrades and the first quarter of operating costs for the shop. The application had gone smoothly. Her credit was thin but clean. The loan officer had told her the approval was straightforward and she should expect a decision within 3 weeks. 5 weeks later, she called to check the status. After being transferred twice, she reached a different officer who told her that an anonymous inquiry had been filed questioning the validity of the property ownership records for 114 Millard Street. Until the ownership documentation could be independently verified, the loan was on administrative hold. "Who filed the inquiry?" Maya asked. "Anonymous submissions don't carry identifying information," the officer said. "I'm sorry. These things usually resolve within 4 to 6 weeks once the documentation is reviewed." Maya thanked him and ended the call. 4 to 6 weeks. By then, the development offers would have either multiplied or disappeared, depending on how the National Rail Dynamics announcement played out. Someone was using the gap between where she was and where the information would eventually become public, using that gap like a waiting room, hoping she would get uncomfortable enough to walk out before the door opened. She understood the strategy. She just hadn't expected it to feel this specific. Ray came by on Friday evening, ostensibly to help her sort a carburetor delivery, but actually, she knew, to check on her. He had a habit of showing up with practical reasons when his real reason was concern, which she had always appreciated because it let them both pretend the concern wasn't necessary. He listened to the inspection story and the loan story without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You should consider the offers," he said finally. "Not forever, just seriously." He held up a hand before she could respond. "I'm not saying sell. I'm saying understand what you're carrying. These aren't random annoyances, Maya. Someone is running a deliberate play, and whoever it is has more resources than you do right now." "I know that." "Do you know that 240 becomes a lot more attractive when the alternative is fighting code violations and frozen loans while trying to keep the lights on?" Maya looked at him steadily. "Walter told me not to sell too fast. Walter is 78 and in a nursing home, and his health is failing," Ray said, not unkindly. "I'm not sure he fully accounted for the part where someone starts applying pressure before you have the resources to push back." It was a fair point. Maya knew it was a fair point. She also knew that fair points were sometimes the most dangerous ones, because they came wrapped in enough reasonableness to make you stop thinking clearly. She told Ray she would consider it, and meant it enough to sleep badly that night. What changed everything was Ethan. Not in a dramatic way, not in a movie way, in the small, sideways way that children sometimes say the thing that adults have been carefully avoiding. He was sitting at the kitchen table on Saturday morning doing homework when he looked up at her and said, "Are we going to have to leave the garage?" Maya looked at him. "What makes you ask that?" "You have your worried face," he said. "You had it when we had to leave the apartment on Grover Street, and when Grandpa died." He went back to his homework. "The garage isn't bad like those things, so I thought maybe you were just worried about it, not that it was actually going to happen." Maya sat down across from him. "People are making things difficult," she said carefully. Ethan nodded, still writing. "Because they want it?" "Yes." "Then it must be worth something." He said it simply, the way children state things that adults complicate. Maya looked at her son for a moment, 10 years old, homework spread in front of him, completely certain. "Yeah," she said. "I think it is." "Then don't quit." He turned a page. "Grandpa didn't quit when things were difficult. You always say that." She had said that. She had said it to comfort him after her father died, to explain why they stayed in Akron, to answer the question of why some people hold on to things that don't make obvious sense to hold on to. She hadn't expected it to come back to her at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, delivered by a 10-year-old. She sat with it for a while. Then she put her jacket on and drove to the garage. She had not intended to search. She was planning to go over the code violation notes and begin pricing the repairs, practical things. But she had been staring at the wall behind the old tool cabinet for 20 minutes, and there was something about it that bothered her. The cabinet itself was original to the building, welded steel, heavy, the kind of thing nobody moves unless they have to. But the wall directly behind it showed a faint outline, a seam that didn't match the surrounding concrete blocks. She moved the cabinet with a floor jack, working slowly and methodically, the way her father had taught her to approach anything that required patience. Behind it was another panel, smaller than the first one, newer, or at least less weathered, sealed with a different kind of locking mechanism, a simple quarter-turn industrial latch that was stiff but functional. Inside this compartment, the documents were not wrapped in oilcloth. They were sealed in a waterproof plastic folder of the kind that engineers use on outdoor survey sites. Someone had placed them here more recently than the first set, more deliberately. Inside the folder were two things. The first was a full set of railway blueprints, not survey notes, but actual engineering drawings, detailed and precise, showing the entire northern Ohio corridor, with the junction point at Millard Street marked clearly. The access route was drawn in red ink. Every measurement was exact. The property boundary of 114 Millard Street was outlined in the same red ink and extended well beyond the garage walls, exactly as Walter's notes had described. The second was a signed legal document, 3 pages, an easement agreement between the Ohio Rail Survey Division and the property at 114 Millard Street, dated 2003, signed by 2 senior rail engineers and notarized. Maya read it slowly, once, making sure she understood each section. The agreement confirmed that the property held a perpetual access easement, a legal right-of-way that could not be overridden by subsequent private land transfers without the explicit consent of the property owner, not the rail company, not a development firm, not Victor Hale. The property owner. Her. She sat on the concrete floor of her garage for a long time, the blueprints spread across her knees, the easement agreement in her hands. Outside, the freight tracks ran quiet and still in the dark. But not, she understood now, for much longer. The Ohio Rail Archive Center in Columbus was not the kind of place that appeared in travel guides. It occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse on the eastern edge of the city, wedged between a printing company and a parking structure, with a sign above the entrance that looked like it hadn't been updated since the building's previous life. Inside, it smelled like old paper and climate-controlled air, and the kind of quiet that exists in places where information is stored rather than used. Maya had called ahead. The archivist who met her at the front desk was a small, methodical woman named Grace Holloway, who wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and had the particular calm of someone who spent most of their working life handling things that other people had forgotten mattered. Maya placed the waterproof folder on the counter. Grace looked at the contents carefully, the blueprints first, then the easement agreement, without touching them. Then she looked up. "Where did you find these?" "Hidden in a property I recently purchased in Akron," Maya said. "I need to know if they're authentic." Grace studied her for a moment, then picked up the easement agreement with gloved hands and carried it to a light board at the back of the room. Maya followed. It took Grace 40 minutes to complete her initial review. She cross-referenced the document's signatures against the archive's personnel records, verified the notary seal against the state register, and matched the engineering drawing specifications against the archive's copy of the original Northern Corridor survey files, which, she mentioned without drama, were among the most requested records in the building over the past 3 months. 3 months. Maya filed that detail quietly. "The signatures are authentic," Grace said finally, setting the easement agreement down with the careful precision of someone returning something valuable to its correct position. Both engineers who signed this document were senior members of the Ohio Rail Survey Division. We have their personnel records on file. She paused. The notarization is also legitimate. This is a valid legal document. Maya exhaled slowly. And the blueprints? Consistent with the original survey drawings for the Northern Corridor project, the technical specifications match our archive copies exactly. Grace removed her glasses and looked at Maya directly. Ms. Carter, do you understand what this easement means, legally? I think so, but I'd like to hear it from someone who knows. Grace was quiet for a moment, choosing her words. A perpetual access easement of this type, attached to a specific property, means that the land rights cannot be transferred, overridden, or extinguished by any subsequent private transaction without the explicit written consent of the current property owner. It is essentially a legal anchor. Any development requiring access through that corridor, regardless of how much money is involved or who holds the surrounding land, would need the cooperation of whoever owns 114 Millard Street. She looked at the documents again. Whoever filed this easement understood exactly what they were doing. They were making the property permanently significant, regardless of what happened to the rail network around it. Maya nodded slowly. She was about to thank Grace and gather the documents when the archivist said something that stopped her. There's one more thing I should show you. Grace led her to a secondary room at the back of the archive, a smaller space lined with indexed filing drawers and a single long table. She pulled a drawer, thumbed through folders with practiced efficiency, and placed a thin file on the table in front of Maya. Personnel correspondence file, Grace said. From the Corridor Preservation Project, early 2000s. I noticed the name when I was cross-referencing the easement signatures. Maya looked at the tab on the folder. Carter, D. Contractor Correspondence, 2001 to 2003. The room was very quiet. Maya opened the folder. Inside were 5 letters, typed on rail company letterhead, addressed to a David Carter, describing contracted survey assistance work carried out on the Northern Ohio Corridor project between 2001 and 2003. The work included site access verification, boundary marking, and what the letters described as document preservation and placement along the corridor route. The final letter, dated November 2003, was a formal acknowledgement of project completion. At the bottom was a handwritten note in different ink, added separately from the typed text. DC. The records are placed correctly. If the line ever runs again, whoever stands at that junction will understand why we did this. WJWJ. Walter Jennings. Maya read the note 3 times. The letters swam slightly, and she blinked, and they steadied. Her father had not stumbled into this. He had not simply worked near the rail lines. He had been part of the preservation effort, deliberately recruited, she understood now, because Walter had needed someone with local knowledge and access who could be trusted to place the documents correctly and say nothing about it afterward. Her father had known exactly what he was hiding in that garage. He had known the easement existed. He had known the property's value, and he had never told anyone. Not because he forgot, because he was waiting for the right time, which had run out before it arrived. Maya sat down at the archive table without asking permission. Grace, who had been watching her with the quiet attentiveness of someone practiced in witnessing people receive difficult information, placed a box of tissues on the table without comment and went back to the front desk. Maya did not cry, not exactly. But she sat there for a while, with her father's name on the page in front of her, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was looking at. A man who had believed in something long-term, who had done something patient and careful and completely thankless, who had gone to his grave without seeing any of it matter, and who had, she now understood, been trying to leave her something she wouldn't understand until she needed it. The garage was not an accident. She had found it because she had been looking for exactly that kind of space, in exactly that neighborhood, at exactly the price point her father would have known she could manage. The demolition notice, the $500, even the timing. She had walked past that garage 100 times and only stopped the morning Victor Hale happened to be standing outside it. None of that was proof of anything. She was not a woman who believed in neat explanations for complicated things, but she made a copy of every document in the file, thanked Grace Holloway with a sincerity that seemed to surprise the archivist, and walked back to her car, carrying something that felt less like evidence and more like a conversation she had been waiting 4 years to finish. Victor's property lawyer called him on a Thursday morning with the particular tone of someone delivering news they would rather not deliver. "The easement is real," the lawyer said. "We had 3 people look at it independently. The document is properly executed, properly notarized, and properly recorded in the state archive, which is actually the problem. It was recorded quietly in 2003 under a supplemental filing that didn't get picked up in standard title searches. Our initial due diligence on the Millard Street property missed it entirely." Victor was standing at his office window. He looked at the skyline without seeing it. "What does that mean for the corridor access?" "It means we cannot route the eastern section of the terminal project through that junction without Ms. Carter's written consent. Legally, there is no workaround. The easement predates every subsequent land transaction and cannot be extinguished unilaterally." A pause. "It also means the property's value is not what we initially assessed. The access rights attached to it make it a controlling position in the entire Eastern Corridor development." "How much?" Victor asked. The lawyer's pause this time was longer. "Conservatively, somewhere between 15 and 30 million, depending on how the terminal contracts develop. Possibly more." Victor said nothing. "Victor," the lawyer said carefully, "the 3 million offer you've extended, she hasn't signed anything yet?" "No." "Then I would strongly recommend approaching this differently going forward. If she has legal counsel, and at this point she should, the 3 million position is going to look very different to her than it did 2 weeks ago." Victor ended the call and stood at the window for a long time. He thought about the Monday morning in November when he had stood outside a crumbling garage and laughed. When he had signed away a controlling stake in a $4 billion development corridor because it was costing him $300 a month in taxes. He had made thousands of property transactions in his career. He had never once misjudged a piece of land this badly. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Arrange the New York meeting," he said. "Investor conference, private dinner, bring the Carter proposal." He paused. "Make it look like an opportunity, not a negotiation." His assistant asked what the difference was. Victor looked at his reflection in the window glass. "Presentation," he said. The invitation arrived in a cream envelope with Victor Hale's company letterhead embossed at the top. It was not a legal notice. It was not a negotiation letter. It was a personal invitation to attend the Hale Industrial Annual Investor Conference in New York City. 2 nights at the Meridian Grand Hotel, travel covered, dinner included, with a handwritten note at the bottom in Victor's own writing that said simply, "I believe we can find an arrangement that works well for both of us. I hope you'll come." Maya read it twice at her kitchen table. Then she took a photograph of it, sent the photograph to Ray, and called him before he had time to reply. "He's trying to make it feel like a favor," Ray said immediately. "I know. New York, nice hotel, dinner. He wants you off balance and grateful before you sit down." "I know that too." "Are you going?" Maya looked at the envelope. "I need to understand exactly what I'm sitting on before I can decide what to do with it. He knows more than I do about the terminal contracts and the warehouse deals. Being in that room might be the fastest way to close that gap." Ray was quiet for a moment. "That's either very smart or very risky." "It's both," Maya said. "That's usually what smart looks like." She confirmed the invitation the following morning. She also, before confirming, spent 3 days on the phone with a property rights attorney named Sandra Obi, who had been recommended by Grace Holloway at the Archive Center. Sandra reviewed the easement documents, the blueprints, the survey notes, and the full correspondence file from the archive, and then gave Maya a 2-hour consultation that was the most expensive 2 hours she had ever spent, and the most valuable. She flew to New York on a Thursday. The Meridian Grand was the kind of hotel that made you feel like your clothes were slightly wrong, regardless of what you were wearing. Maya had bought a simple dark blazer and good trousers for the trip, practical and clean, and she wore them with the same straightforward confidence she wore a work jacket. Not performing anything, just dressed for a job. Victor met her in the lobby on Thursday evening, smooth and welcoming in the way of a man who had done this 1,000 times, who knew exactly how much warmth to deploy and when to pull it back. He shook her hand, told her she looked well, and guided her toward the hotel restaurant with the particular ease of someone steering a conversation before it began. They had dinner. Victor ordered wine she didn't drink and food she barely touched, and talked about the development project in broad, enthusiastic terms, the scale of it, the economic impact on Ohio, the opportunity for communities that had been waiting for exactly this kind of investment. He made it sound like something he was doing for Akron rather than to it. Maya listened carefully and said very little. After dinner, he placed a document folder on the table between them. $3 million, he said. Clean transfer, no conditions. You walk away with more money than most people see in a lifetime, and you can build whatever you want, wherever you want, for you and your son. He opened the folder to the signature page and placed a pen beside it. I think this is genuinely fair, Maya. I want you to believe that. Maya looked at the document without touching it. $3 million. She had done the math on that number many times over the past weeks. What it meant for Ethan's education. What it meant for her mother's medical bills. What it meant to never check her bank account balance with the specific dread she had carried for years. $3 million was not a number. It was a physical sensation, the feeling of a weight she had been carrying so long she had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Her hand moved slightly toward the pen. Then Victor's phone buzzed on the table between them, and he glanced at it and turned it face down and said, "Excuse me 1 second," and stood and walked toward the entrance of the restaurant to take the call. And Maya, alone at the table with the document in front of her, heard the conversation happening at the booth directly behind her. She had not been aware of the 2 men sitting there during dinner. The restaurant was full, and the ambient noise had kept individual conversations private. But Victor had moved, and the noise had shifted, and the booth behind her was close enough that she could hear clearly without trying. "Warehouse contracts are already pre-negotiated," one voice was saying, low, businesslike. 3 of the 5 major shipping partners have signed letters of intent. The access corridor is the last piece. And the easement situation? The second voice was quieter, more careful. If Hale closes the Millard Street deal tonight, the corridor is unencumbered. The terminal construction timeline moves forward as planned. A brief pause. The warehouse contracts alone are valued at about $800 million over the first decade. That's before the secondary logistics deals. And if he doesn't close tonight? Then we have a property owner sitting on a legal easement that controls access to the whole eastern section, and she'll eventually figure out what that means, if she hasn't already. A short silence. What's he offering her? $3 million. The second man made a sound that was almost a laugh. On an asset that effectively controls access to the better part of $1 billion in contracts? He's hoping she doesn't know the full picture yet. Maya sat very still. She looked at the signature page in front of her. She looked at the pen beside it. She thought about $3 million, and she thought about $800 million, and she thought about a man who had stood outside a crumbling building and laughed, and sold it for $500, and then spent 2 months trying to buy it back, before she understood why. She closed the document folder. She placed the pen on top of it, precisely, parallel to the edge. Then she picked up her water glass and took a slow sip and waited. Victor came back to the table 2 minutes later, phone pocketed, expression resettled into the easy confidence he had been wearing all evening. He looked at the closed folder. He looked at Maya. Something moved behind his eyes. A recalculation, fast and invisible to anyone who wasn't watching for it. But Maya was watching for it. "I need a little more time to review it," she said pleasantly. Victor smiled. "Of course, there's no pressure here. Take the evening." He reached for his wine glass. "The offer stands through tomorrow morning." "That's generous," Maya said. She stayed for another 20 minutes, making conversation about Akron and the development timeline and Ethan's interest in engineering, because she was not a woman who made dramatic exits when a quiet one would do. She asked questions about the terminal project that were just informed enough to show she was paying attention and just general enough not to reveal how much she had heard. Victor answered them warmly, still certain he was steering the evening, still certain the folder would come back to him, signed. When she finally stood to leave, he extended his hand. "I hope we can finalize this tomorrow," he said. "I appreciate the invitation," Maya said, and shook his hand. She walked across the hotel lobby without hurrying. She stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for her floor, and stood quietly as the doors closed. Then she took out her phone and sent Sandra Obi a message. "Still here. Didn't sign. Call me tomorrow morning. I think we need to talk about what the easement is actually worth." She put the phone back in her pocket and looked at her reflection in the elevator's polished doors. She looked, she thought, like someone who had just figured out the rules of a game she had been playing without knowing the rules. She also looked, for the first time in a long time, like someone who was going to win it. Downstairs, Victor returned to the table and picked up the document folder. He opened it to the signature page. Blank. He stood there for a moment in the quiet noise of the restaurant, holding a $3 million offer that a woman working 2 jobs in Akron had just walked away from in front of his investors without raising her voice or changing her expression. He closed the folder slowly. Around him, 3 of his largest investors were watching from across the room, waiting for the signal that the corridor deal was done. He did not give them one. The morning after New York, Maya sat in her hotel room with Sandra Obi on the phone and a notepad full of numbers she was still getting used to looking at. Sandra had spent the previous night reviewing everything Maya had sent her: the easement agreement, the blueprints, the archived correspondence, the overheard conversation in the restaurant. And when she spoke, she had the focused clarity of someone who had already organized her thoughts into a clean sequence. "The easement gives you a legal right-of-way that cannot be bypassed," Sandra said. "That means no construction crew, no development firm, and no private rail company can access that corridor without your written consent. Not Hale Industrial, not National Rail Dynamics, not anyone." She paused. "What you overheard last night about the warehouse contracts, if that figure is accurate, you are not negotiating a property sale. You are negotiating an access agreement on an asset that controls the gateway to $1 billion development network." Maya wrote the word gateway on the notepad and underlined it. "What does that change?" she asked. "Everything," Sandra said. "A property sale ends your involvement. An access agreement keeps you at the table permanently. Licensing fees, revenue sharing, long-term partnership stakes, these are not unusual arrangements when a private landowner holds a legally protected position on critical infrastructure." Another pause. "But Maya, to negotiate this correctly, you cannot do it alone, and you cannot do it quietly. You need this in the open. Once the full picture becomes public, the pressure campaign stops, because it only works in the dark." Maya looked out the hotel window at the New York skyline. She thought about the fake inspection, the frozen loan, the carefully generous dinner, and the folder with the pen placed beside it. "How do I bring it into the open?" she asked. "Let me make some calls," Sandra said. "There are infrastructure journalists who have been covering the National Rail Dynamics story. The easement is a matter of public record. It's already in the state archive. Anyone who looks in the right place can find it." She sounded almost dry. We just need to make sure the right people look in the right place at the right time. Maya flew home the following morning. The next 6 weeks moved faster than any period in her life had moved before, and at the same time, with the strange, underwater slowness of things that matter too much to rush. Sandra filed a formal legal notification with the Ohio State Property Office, confirming the easement's active status and its applicability to the Northern Corridor Development Project. The filing was public. Within 4 days, 2 infrastructure reporters had picked it up. Within a week, the story had moved beyond the property and business sections into general news. Single mother holds legal key to Ohio's biggest rail development in 2 decades. Maya did not seek the attention, but she did not hide from it either. She gave 2 interviews, both short and factual, because Sandra had told her that silence gets filled with other people's interpretations, and she was better served by telling her own story in her own words. She talked about the garage, about her father, about Walter Jennings and what the engineers had tried to preserve. She did not talk about Victor Hale by name. She did not need to. The story told itself once people had the documents. National Rail Dynamics contacted Sandra directly 8 days after the filing. The conversation was different from anything Victor had offered. No cream envelopes, no hotel dinners, no carefully placed pens. A senior legal and development team, a formal meeting, and a question they had not asked before. Not, what will it take to buy you out? What would it take to build this together? Maya brought Ray to that meeting. She sat across from 4 people in expensive suits and listened to them lay out the corridor project in full detail for the first time. The terminal site, the warehouse network, the projected freight volumes, the timeline. Everything Victor had been carefully not telling her for months, delivered plainly and completely because the legal situation had removed the advantage of keeping her uninformed. When they finished, Maya placed a single sheet of paper on the table. She had written it herself, with Sandra's guidance, over 3 evenings at the kitchen table while Ethan did homework beside her. It was not a sale agreement. It was a partnership proposal. The garage and the access corridor would remain in her ownership permanently. In exchange for granting the necessary easements for the terminal construction, she was requesting a long-term revenue share agreement, a designated repair and logistics facility within the new transit district, first-right contracts for mechanical servicing on the corridor infrastructure, and a community employment provision requiring that a percentage of local technical jobs be offered to Akron residents first. The National Rail Dynamics team read it in silence. The senior legal officer looked up. "You wrote this yourself?" "With my attorney, yes." He looked at it again. "The community employment clause is unusual for this type of agreement." "It's the clause I care most about," Maya said. There was a short silence around the table. Then the senior development officer, a woman named Carol Sung, who had said very little until that moment, looked at Maya with an expression that was not quite professional neutrality. "Give us 48 hours, she said. They came back in 36. The agreement took another 3 weeks to finalize. Lawyers on both sides, revisions, a provision adjustment on the revenue share timeline, a clarification on the employment clause language. Sandra worked 16-hour days. Maya worked her regular shifts at the garage in between phone calls and document reviews because the bills did not pause for negotiations, and Ethan still needed dinner every evening. Ray handled the shop when she couldn't be there. He did it without being asked and without discussing it, which was his way of saying he believed in what she was building. The agreement was signed on a Friday afternoon in Sandra's Columbus office. No hotel restaurant, no cream envelopes, a plain conference room, a long table, and 2 parties who both understood exactly what they were agreeing to. Maya signed her name at the bottom of the final page and felt something she hadn't been able to name until that moment. Not triumph exactly, and not relief, though there was relief in it. It was more like resolution, the feeling of a long sentence finally reaching its period. Victor's losses came quietly, the way serious losses usually do. No single dramatic consequence, no public exposure. Just a series of investor conversations that became shorter and cooler after the easement story became public. 2 development contracts his firm had been negotiating were quietly redirected to other parties, once word spread that his due diligence on the corridor project had missed a critical recorded document. One major investor moved their infrastructure portfolio to a competitor without explanation. His company was not ruined. Victor Hale was not a man who could be ruined by one miscalculation. He had too many other positions, too many other assets, too many other deals running in parallel. But the reputation he had built on sharp judgment and thorough research had developed a visible crack, and in the world he operated in, that crack mattered more than most financial losses. He did not call Maya again. He did not send another envelope. Construction around Akron began in the spring. Maya watched it from the garage, the survey crews first, then the groundbreaking equipment, then the slow and methodical transformation of the old industrial district into something that looked like a future rather than a memory. She hired her first employee in March, a 23-year-old mechanic named Darius, who had grown up 4 streets away and had been working at a gas station for 2 years because no shop in the district had been hiring. By April, she had 2 more, both local, both young, both good with their hands and hungry to work somewhere that felt like it was going somewhere. She told each of them, on their first day, the same thing her father used to say: "Every machine has a story. You just have to listen." She was on the garage floor one evening, reviewing the construction timeline documents spread across the hood of a customer's car, when Ethan came in from school and sat on the workbench the way he always did, dropping his backpack, reaching automatically for the water bottle he kept on the second shelf. He looked at the construction plans. He looked at her. "Is it actually going to happen?" he asked. Maya looked at the plans, at the red-inked boundary lines she had memorized months ago, at the name she had already decided on for the expanded facility. "It's already happening," she said. Ethan nodded slowly, looking at the documents with the seriousness he reserved for things he was genuinely trying to understand. "Dad would have liked this," he said. Maya looked at her son. "He's the one who built it," she said quietly. "I just found it." The garage was full of evening light and the distant sound of construction beginning its work a few blocks over, building something over the bones of something old, the way cities sometimes remember what they were always supposed to become. The morning of the grand opening, Maya arrived at Carter Rail Works before anyone else. She had set her alarm for 5:30, but was awake by 4, lying in the dark with the particular alertness of someone whose mind had already started the day without them. She made coffee, stood at the kitchen window while Ethan slept, and watched the sky over Akron shift from black to the deep, uncertain blue that exists just before dawn decides what kind of morning it is going to be. She thought about the Monday morning a year ago, when she had been walking to a bus stop with $43 in her account and a toolbox in her hand. She tried to locate the exact feeling of that morning, the weight of it, the specific texture of tired that comes from years of running just fast enough to stay in place. She wanted to remember it clearly, not to be sad about it, but because she had learned, in the past year, that gratitude without memory is just luck, and what she felt standing at that window was not luck. She drove to the garage in the early quiet before the trucks and the ceremony crews arrived. The building that greeted her was not the building she had bought. The bones were the same, the square footprint, the position beside the freight tracks, the concrete walls that had survived decades of neglect through sheer stubbornness. But everything else had been transformed. The roll-up door had been replaced with wide glass panels that let the morning light in. The floor was clean, leveled, and properly drained. The ventilation system hummed efficiently in the ceiling. New equipment stood in organized rows, lifts, diagnostic stations, a full fabrication bay at the back. And along the east wall, where the old rusted shelving had once stood, there was a framed display Maya had put together herself. The original survey maps, The handwritten notes with Walter Jennings's signature, the easement agreement, the archive letters with her father's name, her father's photograph, taken sometime in the late 90s, standing beside a truck he had just finished rebuilding, looking at the camera with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a man who had done something real with his hands that day. Beneath the photograph, a small brass plate. David Carter. He believed in the long game. Maya stood in front of it for a while in the empty building, her coffee cooling in her hand, the hum of the ventilation system the only sound. Then the trucks began arriving, and the morning began in earnest. By 9 o'clock, the Akron Transit District was filling with people. The new freight corridor ran through the heart of the old industrial neighborhood, 3 kilometers of modernized track connecting the National Rail Dynamics Terminal to the warehouse network, with the junction at Millard Street precisely where Walter Jennings's survey notes had always said it would be. Around the corridor, construction had seeded a cluster of new businesses over the past months: logistics firms, supply companies, a small hotel, 2 restaurants, and a training center for freight and mechanical certification that Maya had quietly lobbied for from the beginning. Carter Rail Works sat at the center of it all, not because it was the largest building in the new district, but because it was the first one, the foundation everything else had grown around. The ceremony stage had been set up in the open space between the garage and the track, and by 10 o'clock it was surrounded by a crowd that surprised Maya with its size. Local business owners she had worked with over the past year. Darius and her other mechanics, standing together near the side entrance in their clean work shirts, looking at the crowd with the slightly stunned expressions of people who had shown up for a regular job and somehow ended up at a historical event. Ray stood near the back, arms folded, watching everything with quiet satisfaction, which was the most enthusiasm she had ever seen him display publicly. Sandra Obi was there, standing near the front, looking as composed as she always did, and as pleased as she was prepared to admit. Walter Jennings arrived at 10:15. His daughter Patricia pushed his wheelchair through the crowd, and people made way without being asked, sensing without being told that this was someone who mattered to the morning in a particular way. Walter was dressed carefully, a dark jacket, a collared shirt, his large surveyor's hands resting on his knees. He looked thinner than when Maya had seen him in Cleveland a year ago, and slower, and smaller in the way that time sometimes compresses people. But his eyes, when Maya crouched down beside his chair to greet him, were exactly the same. Clear, direct, unhurried. "You did it," he said. "We did it," Maya said. "You started it. My father carried it. I just finished it." Walter looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the track, at the facility, at the crowd, at the junction point that he had spent 30 years quietly trying to protect. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Patricia put her hand on her father's shoulder and caught Maya's eye and nodded once. And in that nod was everything that didn't need to be said out loud: the gratitude, the relief, the particular peace that comes when something you gave years to finally arrives where it was always going. The first train moved through the corridor at 11 o'clock. It was a freight hauler, long, deliberate, the sound of it building from a low vibration in the ground to a full, resonant presence that Maya felt in her chest before she heard it clearly. The crowd went quiet as it approached, not a ceremonial quiet imposed by schedule, a natural one, the kind that falls over people when something significant is actually happening and everyone present understands it at the same time. Maya stood beside Ethan at the edge of the track boundary, close enough to feel the displaced air as the train passed. Ethan watched it with his whole face open, the expression of a 10-year-old who had not yet learned to manage how much he let things affect him, and who would hopefully take a long time to learn that lesson. When the last car cleared the junction and the sound faded down the line toward the terminal, he looked up at her. "Grandpa would have watched that about 50 more times," he said. Maya laughed. It came out fully and without effort, the kind of laugh that surfaces from somewhere deeper than the moment. "Minimum," she said. Victor Hale arrived at 12:30. Maya noticed him at the edge of the crowd before he saw her, standing slightly apart from the main gathering, hands in the pockets of a coat that cost more than most of the people around him earned in a month, watching the facility with an expression she found difficult to categorize. Not bitterness, not quite regret, something more complicated than either, the expression of a man who understood exactly what had happened and exactly what his role in it had been, and was standing with that understanding rather than walking away from it. She could have ignored him. The day was full and generous and did not require his presence to be complete. Instead, she walked over. He saw her coming and straightened slightly, not defensively, she thought, more like a man preparing to receive something honestly. "I didn't expect you to be here," Maya said. "I wasn't sure I should be," he said. He looked at the building, at the brass letters above the entrance, Carter Rail Works, and then back at her. "I wanted to see what I'd underestimated." Maya looked at him for a moment. "You didn't underestimate the land," she said. "You underestimated the person standing on it." Victor was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not shame exactly, but the honest acknowledgement that lives just beside it. "Yes," he said, "I did." It was not an apology. Maya did not need one. The day was too full for things that came too late. She nodded once and left him at the edge of the crowd and walked back toward the life she had built from a locked door and a question that had followed her home, and a father who had believed in something long enough to hide it in the floor of a $500 garage. Late in the afternoon, after the speeches and the handshakes and the long, good tiredness of a day that had earned its own ending, Maya sat on the steps of Carter Rail Works with Ethan beside her. The crowd had thinned. The track was quiet again. The new district hummed with the low, productive energy of things that had found their purpose. Ethan leaned his head against her shoulder. "What happens now?" he asked. Maya looked at the track, at the junction, at the place where her father's long, patient, invisible work had finally surfaced into the light where it belonged. "Now we run the shop," she said. "Same as always." Ethan considered this. "Same as always," he repeated, "but different." Maya put her arm around him. "Yeah," she said, "but different." The evening settled over Akron with the particular softness of days that have given everything they had. Somewhere down the line, another train was building toward the junction. She could feel the vibration beginning in the ground before it was sound, before it was anything but a quiet signal that something was moving, something was coming. Something that had been still for a very long time was finally, undeniably, on its way. She closed her eyes and listened. "Every machine has a story," her father had said. "You just have to listen." She had listened, and the machine, after all these years, was running.